back into another night of Say That Again, where we are going to discuss here live at Calvary some recaps from this past Sunday. I'm so glad you're here joining us online tonight. Pastor Bo here, the associate pastor, along with Audra. And we're going to be hanging out with you tonight, along with some of our people here in the church. We've been gone for a few weeks. We had a little bit of one of those days, right, as we're going to be talking about. And so it's been a long few weeks. We did have some damage here in the sanctuary, so last week we couldn't be with you, but we are so excited to be jumping back into this study and really recapping some things on Sunday because, you know, Michael's done the last few weeks. This is our first time really without him. But what I would say is the reason we're doing this on Wednesday nights is because sometimes you blow through a Sunday and you may hear a great message and may be inspired. But I don't know if you're like I am, but when I leave church sometimes, those thoughts, those ideas, especially if I don't take notes, they're gone pretty soon after that. So I know it was inspired. I know it was a good message, but sometimes don't we all need a reminder? I mean, I was talking with Nate right here before the service. We were talking about some things that we learned probably, you said 40 years ago, right? For me, it was like in seminary 10 years ago, and yet today it's hard to remember those things. So it's good to relearn and remember things, and I'm really excited to revisit our past Sunday's message. The title was One of Those Days, and it came from Luke chapter 8. I don't know how many sermons Michael can get out of being in the boat.
Impressed so far.
He's doing a pretty good job.
Yeah.
We're in the boat again. We're having a storm again. We're seeing the disciples once again be blown away by the weather, right? It's another tale of a similar story that we've already been through a few weeks now. But Michael really honed in this last week on the first real phrase of the passage, which talks about it was one of those days. And he really used that to relate for all of us what it means to have one of those days come up in our lives, and especially when we talk about storms and trials and things in our life. So it's going to be a really good time recapping that. But before we get into all that, I just thought we'd ask a general question. Favorite moment from Sunday? What's one thing that stuck out to you, Audra, as you heard Michael preach, or maybe it was something even related to Sunday in general?
I would say there's two things that stood out to me. One was just the power of everybody being together. And right now, if you haven't been on campus yet, if you look around the worship center, it looks just a little bit different. The carpet's all gone. We've had to do some major removal of things because of the storm. And I was sitting over at the welcome desk, and I looked across the room, and just to see everybody together worshiping. And the worship center does not look its best right now. And usually we're used to seeing this place in its pristine condition. And it was beautiful because it wasn't about what the floor looked like. It wasn't about were the lights in the right spot. It was people truly worshiping God. And so for me, that was just like a really neat moment to remember. It's not about the glitz and the glam, it's about the heart of what worship is about. So that stood out to me first of all. The other thing that stood out from the time in the Word was honestly the title, One of Those Days. I mean, we can all relate to that. We all have those moments where maybe it's what we just walked through, maybe it's something back in a different season of life that you're in, or you're in right now where you just had one of those days where you're like, what is going on? I cannot do this. And so for me, when I heard that, I immediately and emotionally, mentally was like in a different zone of thinking, yeah, what do I normally do when I have one of those days? And so I loved how we got to unpack what do we do when we have those days, because we've had them, and guess what? We're going to still have them the rest of our days until we're with the Lord, just because of the world that we live in. So those were my two moments.
Yeah, and I go right with you, because I think, you know, especially if you've stayed online, maybe you weren't able to come to church Sunday, or maybe you haven't been by in a while. I mean, coming back from a storm, we're very blessed, and we want to emphasize that as a church. We're able to meet. We've got power. We're all doing okay, although we know there are some people that are struggling in our church family. We're going to make it through this, and we are going to overcome this. And but at the same time, obviously, going through a storm and then having to deal with damage. Our worship center, if you can't see right now, chairs are stacked in the corner. The carpet is completely ripped up in here. We've got damage in the other parts of the building. And, you know, it really did feel appropriate to talk about what happens when things don't go according to plan, because for us as a staff and as a church, this ain't part of the plan. And so So for me, it's kind of the same reflections. It was really sweet to see everybody here Sunday. And I just want to tell you, if you're online tonight and maybe you haven't come on campus like on Wednesdays for this, let me encourage you, part of the sweetness of it is as you are able, getting back together, because seeing people, it's not just content delivery. I know that's our primary thing we think about with church, but seeing people, that was one of the blessings for me Sunday, was seeing our faith family together, seeing people back in town from being evacuated and getting to experience this together. And so it's really neat. And then we talked about one of these days with storms. The first thing I want to bring up before we even get into the passage is, what are other parts of the Bible that you would say? So we've talked a lot about the guys in the boat, on the waves, all that. What are other parts that you thought the Bible tells us stories about one of those days popping up for the people of God, followers of Christ? Where do we see other examples of this type of teaching in the Bible?
So when I reflected on this question, I thought of Esther and her story of how she came about and how the Lord was able to use her in this mighty way. And it was just one of those days when you look at her story where it's like, hey, Esther, I realize like you just got put in this position that you're in right now, but you need to stand up for your people, even though it makes no sense whatsoever. And I started thinking like, man, that would have been one of those days where I've been like, this is insane and this makes no sense whatsoever. And I would have been like, I think I'm out, actually. I would rather not have this day happening to me right now. But in that moment, she says, well, this is what I believe. This is who I believe in. And this is one of those days that makes no sense, but I'm going to do what you're asking me to do, God. And if you know the story of Esther, God saves the people. He uses her in a way, her voice in a way to protect the people and to make such a bold statement about who God is in that moment. So that's one that stood out to me, because even in the specific verse I think of is, who knows if you were put in this place for such a time as this? And that's what made me say, yeah, well, one of those days happened. It may be for a time like this for God to use me.
That's great. And, along with that, I kind of went Old Testament. I thought about Daniel, the book. I thought about the two examples we know from our childhood of both the guys thrown in the furnace, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and, obviously this whole idea of their culture around them changing, them being challenged to forsake God and bow down before an idol, and then getting thrown into a fiery furnace because of that. And then I thought about, in the midst of all that, the story, there is someone in the midst of that fire with them. And just the power of that. And then fast forward to Daniel, right? And Daniel chooses to pray, even though it was against the law, and people were watching out for that, wanting to catch him in it, and he chooses to pray with an open window even, so that people could see. It was pretty public. He knew what he was doing, but yet in the midst of that, he gets thrown into the lion's den, right? And obviously, I don't like carpet being destroyed, property damage, but I'm definitely glad I'm not looking at a bunch of lions trying to eat me tonight.
Absolutely.
And then he survives the night in the lion's den because God protects him and brings him out. You see the king acknowledge God in that moment. And so, you think about stories like that. And the first thing I'll say in that is, I think as we look at the totality of Scripture, what you begin to see is, although our problems are real, they're significant, they're very hard. When you look at believers throughout history, throughout the Bible, God starts to give you a perspective on life, and it helps you, I think, as you have perspective, not minimize the storms that you might be going through, but instead put them in perspective to realize that some things are pretty devastating and some things aren't really as bad as we make them out to be. We feel really tense and they are very stressful. But for instance, carpet being gone, that carpet will be put back. It's not something that truly is tragic, even though it does cause some stress. But at the same time, if you are going through something that's truly devastating, you can look and see how people weathered these days because God was with them. And so it gives you great hope in the process. And that's kind of the life lesson. You remember the life lesson was about victory, and that, as we weather these storms, we get the victory, right? So, one thing he mentioned, I loved, he mentioned it in the time in Sunday, but I want to make sure we emphasize it. What is the balance, the striking thing between the victory for our lives, and he talked about God getting glory in the midst of that. how does that work? Because if we're not careful on this topic, sometimes it becomes really self-centered. Well, I want my life to have victory.
Right.
And sometimes we don't immediately see the victory, but why is that important? And then how does that work with God gaining glory in the midst of that, Audra?
That's such a great question, because I think so often when we are having one of those days, we're in that storm, in that battle, we will cry out to God and ask him for help, because we realize I can't do this on my own. We see them in the boat crying out like, I need your help. We have that moment where we cry out, and then God brings the victory. And I think it's right there where most of us then say, it's like we just forget who brought the victory. Oh, it's that I brought the victory. That's what we start kind of going into, that whole process of thinking. And we forget to say, no, this victory was not, I had to call out to God to get to this victory. And we forget to glorify him. And so I think realizing that he allows us to have those victories, but the sweetness of that to say, okay, now this should humble me still to know that on my own I couldn't do it. But Lord, you did it through my life, and therefore I will glorify you. I think about moments in my life where God's brought a victory and I claimed it as my own. And let me tell you something, those are not the moments I look back on with fondness. Those are not the sweet moments where I can feel like I grew closer to the Lord. But when I stop and I say, all right, God brought this victory, and now I'm going to stop and pay homage to him. I'm going to say, Lord, you're the one who did this, and I'm going to testify that to others, testify that before him. Then I see my faith actually grows. You know what I mean? Like I actually start to develop more of who God is in my life. And also it's a moment where I'm able to share that with others and be the light of Christ to others and show where he brings victory.
Yeah, it's so true. And, on top of that, I thought about, for me, I thought about not only do we sometimes claim the victory for our own, but also sometimes we just don't want people to even know there was a storm.
Absolutely.
So you've got the chance for us to just say it was us that did it, especially if it's a public thing. Some things that storms pop up, people know about because you can't hide them. But there's so many storms we go through that they are able to be hidden if you keep your act together and you try to keep right between the lines and don't go here and don't go there. There's some storms that come up that you can keep from people around you, and in that, what I was thinking about this week as I thought about that is like, man, how many times do we steal the victory and the glory for God when we just keep quiet what God's done, when we don't talk about how he has delivered? The whole idea and concept of a testimony for our life, not just being about the moment that God saved you, but how he continually saves you time and time again. And that's not saying that your salvation is something you do over and over, but this type of salvation is when he delivers from storms, when he helps you throughout the everyday life. And so many times we know how to tell somebody about maybe how Jesus came into our heart, but yet we forget to continually give him glory for the ways in which he helps us every day. And you look at the passage at the end, it says that Jesus calmed the storm.
Right.
Brought it. And so as they got to the other side, the disciples had a choice to make. They could, just go about their life and keep going, or they could tell people about what God did, right? Yeah. And man, I thought for me, so many times I get through something and God's helped me, but yet because I want to make it look like maybe there wasn't as bad of a storm, God misses out on the glory. And so it's this great tension of mess in our lives being used by God for him to gain glory, and how important that is as part of the Christian experience,
Absolutely, because I think too, what stands out is we see this story 3 times, three different storytellings of this in the Gospels, and that just shows right there how impactful it was for those 3 different people. It could have only just been found in Luke, and it still would have been impactful. But we see that this story was told. All those people were impacted. Those disciples were changed by that moment. And so it's what you just said of if God is able to bring a victory in your life, you need to share that with others, because who knows how you could be affected by hearing that victory in my life, and how you could say, well, if she got that victory, maybe the Lord can do that for me as well. And so it's what you just said about making it about the gospel.
Yeah, yeah. And so, in the victory, he had 3 points of application. How do we gain the victory? How do we walk through those days? The first topic was launching out. And of course, we see in the passage, the disciples had to make a choice, right? They had to get in the boat with Jesus and not stay on shore. And, Michael said, I wrote down the quote, you can't experience victory over any difficult season of life unless you launch out in the boat with Jesus. And, I thought about, so that's obviously the Christian answer, right? When you have trouble, you go out with Jesus. You launch out in the boat. Right. You get into the mess. I thought about, what do we naturally do in that? What is the natural response whenever storms come our way? And I think the two natural responses, the two wrong decisions, but sometimes we make these decisions, is to just stay on the shore and be safe. And Michael talked a lot about that Sunday. Or sometimes even to run completely away from the opportunity, to stay, not just to stay still, but to actually backtrack and maybe go back toward another way, another behavior, another part of your life. And I thought about, in our natural inclination to either try to stay as safe as we can, or when stuff hits our way, just to run as fast as we can away from the difficulty. Why do you think that is? Why do we as people naturally go toward those things so many more times? I know we know as Christians to cry out to God. I'm not saying we don't, but launching out has the idea that we will take intentional steps to put ourselves in position where a storm may come our way, but we're putting ourselves in a position with Jesus, obviously. Why is it our natural inclination to stay away from that?
I think two things. One is the uncertainty. We just don't know what's going to end up happening, and that just scares us because it means we're giving control over to the Lord instead of us trying to be in control. And then two, don't be mad when I say this, okay?
Furious.
All right. I think we're lazy. I really think that sometimes we just struggle with launching out requires work. It requires discipline. It requires intentionality, all those things that you said. And a lot of times it's just easier to kind of sink instead of swim. You know what I'm saying? And so I think will hold people back.
I thought on top of that, not to interrupt you, I just thought on top of that too, how many times do we stay safe because the work is we got to listen to God and got to spend time knowing what he wants us to do. And we just don't know, so therefore we operate as normal, as natural routine, and it's just, we just kind of stay where we are, and it's a difficult concept. Michael did a great job Sunday talking about this idea of sometimes it's new opportunities. Sometimes God's telling you to stay right in the opportunity you're in, but maybe take a different direction. And it's really complex to really understand what is God calling us to do when it comes to launching out. And it's not something that sometimes I can tell you for sure this is the exact right way. We all know as Christians some things that God says don't do, or, do this. But when it comes to opportunities, decisions for our lives, I heard one pastor told me one time when it came to specifically about taking churches and different jobs, he said, sometimes God will give you two great paths and it's just pick one, do it with me, So there's all types of ways in which we have to discern God's voice. I think the premise of this point is not so much all the different confusion about the ways, but it's making the decision to launch out, right?
Absolutely, yeah. I agree with you completely. I think we've had the same pastor tell us the same thing about you can have two paths, and if they both glorify God, neither one is going to be a bad path, but it's saying, okay, I'm actually going to go do something for you, Lord. I'm actually going to take that step wherever it is, wherever you're calling me, and I'm going to go into action. I think so often we will let our fears, our anxieties, our thoughts, our emotions make us stagnant to where we're not moving. And everybody knows stagnant water is gross. Not to relate to the storm, but we all know that's not something we want to be around. Therefore, why do we want to be stagnant in our faith, But launching out requires movement, requires action. But when we do that, how incredible our faith becomes in the moments that we're able to have because of that action.
Yeah, and I love this topic because it really talks about our action before the storm hits. And before we get to our next point, I want to emphasize that because a lot of times, to be real honest with you, when it comes to storms in our lives, we are very reactionary when it comes to God, and we're not very pro-action. We don't do the steps beforehand. A lot of times the storms we're talking about when it comes to church a lot of times is things that come against us, right? And we may not have been doing the launching out to begin with to even be prepared to go through the storm. And this point in particular is talking about intentional decisions of listening to what God wants in your life, trying to be as obedient as you can. We'll talk about that at the end. And then ultimately taking a step to get off the shore and get in the boat with Jesus. That's what all in is all about. And so the good news is when we do that, we know this next point is true. And this point is true whether we have launched out or whether perhaps we're just going along in life and something hits us majorly. And the next point was all about calling out, right?
Right.
It was a great example. I wrote down this quote: to get the victory, you have to cry out to the one who is the master. And Michael really focused on verse 24, talks about them saying, Master, Master, we're perishing. You know, they cried out to their master. They acknowledged the one that was in charge. And this calling out is we all have to have a moment, whether it's reactionary or whether we've been proactive, we've launched out. We all have to come to this moment where we recognize who is in charge.
Right.
And who is the one that, and then he went real kind of crazy on us, right? So then he went to Forrest Gump.
Oh, wait, pause.
Okay.
Top 10 movies, first of all. Like,
For you?
Oh, absolutely. He started going, and I was like, I'm going to try not to quote it back here, so sorry.
No, it's fine.
Side moment.
I'm not really a movie guy, so for me, it's like, whatever, it's fine. I didn't grow up a big movie buff, anything like that. So, but I do know the movie. I do know the part that he was talking about, the reference he was talking about. And I think this whole idea that I love, that I want to talk about tonight, is this idea of our emotions. Because when a storm hits us, I was talking to a lady today that's a friend of mine. She had a friend pass away, and the husband now is without his wife. He has a young daughter without a mom, you know, and there are intense emotions, right, in that situation where the husband is questioning God because he prayed and asked God in the midst of that sickness to heal his wife. And his bride was brought home to be with Jesus. And so in that moment, there's emotion, right? The example from Forrest Gump where somebody's screaming at the waves, at the storm. And we all have those emotions, whether it be anger, whether it be fear, whether it be sadness, whether it be disappointment in God. We all have those moments in the midst of the storm. In this moment, the disciples were truly afraid that they were going to die, and they had the Son of God in the boat with them. And they were that afraid. Right. They were basically, I read it almost as, yes, they acknowledged God in that as the master, but also it's kind of like, what in the world are you doing here? Why? Right. Why don't you just take care of this? You know, there's some true raw emotion in that. How does that work in our Christian life? How do we express emotions healthily before God? But also, you know, in the Christian circle, if it's not careful, sometimes I don't know that we say this, but we definitely feel the pressure to just kind of be like, our prayers need to be sweet and respectful and honor God. And you can get that pressure where you're never going to go before God with true honesty.
Right.
So how do we do that? And how do we do that specifically when we talk about calling out to God in these moments?
Well, one, I think calling out to God the way that you're referring to requires us to take down the walls that we are not comfortable doing. I don't know if you're like me. I'm kind of someone like, I like to keep my stuff together. I like to have it all go into where you may not be able to read me and know like, oh, something's wrong with her right now or anything like that. And I see that carries over to even my relationship with the Lord, where sometimes I don't let the walls down with him. He knows everything already, obviously, but I miss out on the opportunity to have that intimacy with the Lord where I'm able to break the walls down to say, God, I need you right now. And so I think one hiccup that we have is we're scared to let those walls down. And then two, what you just said of we forget that like he wants to do every part of life with us, not just the pretty and clean parts of life, but he walks with us every single day. So in the mundane, in the exciting, in the heartbreaking, in the boring, like he's there at every single step of the way. And therefore we should be able to communicate with him. We should be able to cry out to him like in this moment, or just to say, Lord, this makes no sense, or Lord, I'm really upset right now. So I think we have this fear of like, I can't really say my emotions to him because of his holiness, but realizing he wants to do that. I mean, I do think there's a respect then, like you can't just be like, bad mouthing the Lord while you pray to him and everything. But I think he wants us to break down those walls so we can have that relationship with him where it's actually like, I'm investing in you, Lord, saying this is how I feel about everything and I need you, so then he can pour back into me.
Yeah, and I think he's a big boy. Like, I think in the scheme of things, like you like that, I think God can even handle if we don't approach him in the right way. I mean, I think, I agree with everything you said. I'll take a step further. I think sometimes we do this because we want to believe that we are a lot more further down the spiritual maturity path than we really are. I mean, when stuff really hits us hard and we go through a situation that's really, truly devastating, I think we find out what our faith is really made of. In fact, Jesus says it to them, and I don't think he was judging them. I think he was truly trying to show them the depths of their faith in the Son of God by saying, where is your faith? Yeah. After he calmed the storm, he kind of pointed to the disciples and goes, guys, where's your faith? And I think for us, the reason you want to be able to express honestly where you are with God is to kind of give you a pulse on where your faith is. And it's okay. You're saved. If you believe in Christ, you're saved. You're going to heaven. But we all struggle in maturing our faith. And I think if we just ignore and try to act like we got it all together, we don't grow.
Absolutely.
You know,
Yeah.
And I think that's what the purpose of it is. I was telling that lady today about that situation. I said, encourage that husband to wrestle with God and reach out to us if there's anything we can do, because ultimately, as he wrestles with God, just like we see Jacob do in the Old Testament, he will find an almighty God that's there for him and that will comfort him. And yeah, you may not ever learn the true reason for why his wife is gone. I don't know that we ever get the answers to those hard questions, but our faith will grow in the midst of that.
Absolutely. I can think back to moments in my life where things didn't make sense, or things just weren't. It was one of those days that lasted for one of those months and one of those couple of months. And I can remember looking back, and when I ignored the Lord and said, I'm not going to talk to you about how I'm feeling, I'm not going to even share with you what's going on, that's when it went to that stagnant, that place where I wasn't growing in my faith. And when I finally opened myself up and said, Lord, I need you. I'm mad at you. I have all these emotions at you, but you know what? I know you're for me, and I know that I can't do this without you. I can remember it was like a burning bush moment almost, where like I felt like the Lord was with me and was like, finally, Audra, thank you. Let us commune. Let us have this moment together, and let me strengthen you, pour into you, and bring you out of this. And so it was one of those moments where I got a test on where my faith was, and I realized I need to invest more in you, Lord, and I need you now.
Yeah. We tend to treat God like we do other people, and for the most part in real life, people don't really know what you think. They don't really want to know. But in real healthy relationships, people that really have your back and you really trust and know, someone in that relationship who doesn't express what's wrong, you can't grow the relationship.
No,
But if it's truly healthy, the person on the other side wants to know what's wrong, even if it's expressed in the wrong way. You know, and it's the same thing you're talking about. It's this idea that, yes, once it's finally out there, you can work through it, you can deal with it, you can grow from it. But if it's left behind the wall, there's no growth of your faith. You know, and so it's a great idea of not just calling out to God that he'll answer your prayer, but this idea that calling out to God can grow your faith. And I just want to kind of bring that out a little more. Lastly, you know, he talked about trust and obey, and we got the great rendition from Michael, you know, leading worship on Sunday. You know, I wrote down, you know, the old hymn, the chorus was trust and obey, for there's no other way to be happy in Jesus but to trust and obey. And Michael talked about this relationship between our trust and our obedience. And, you know, how do you see these concepts working together, specifically when it talks about strengthening our character, our faith? How does trusting God but also obeying him, how does that work out in our faith journey?
So I guess being a parent to a 5-year-old, I kind of have a very practical, tangible example of this every day. there's so many times where I'm like, Rory, to my daughter, I need you to trust me and I need you to be obedient right now. And in those moments where she is like, this makes no sense, but I'm going to do what you said, Mom, or I really don't want to do this right now, which I've switched from mama to mom. That happened at 5, y'all. Okay, anyways. She'll say, okay, Mom, I'll be obedient and do this, even though I don't want to. I can see the correlation is she does that because she trusts me to know I'm going to do things for your good. I know the desires of your heart. Yeah, this may not be exactly what you want right now. It may not make sense, but you know that I'm going to do what's best for you. And so I think about that in my own relationship with the Lord of, well, if I trust the Lord to bring me through it, and then he asks me to do something, I need to be obedient because I know I can trust him. I've seen in my own life when I'm not obedient, that's when my trust starts to waver in him. Or if I'm not building up my trust in him, knowing that he wants my good, then I'm less likely to be obedient to what he's called me to. So I think they're not a yo-yo. That's not a right analogy right there. But like they go hand in hand of like if you're lacking in one, then the other one is going to be affected.
Yeah, not a yo-yo.
Not a yo-yo. What was I thinking?
I don't know. Push and pull. I don't know. But you're right. They do go hand in hand. I thought about the fact that like this story shows us that like if the waves will listen to God and do what he says to Jesus in this moment,
Yep.
Well,
why
wouldn't we, right?
Yeah.
This whole idea of like, I wonder if even this example of even nature obeying God is an example to the disciples, but also to us as disciples of Jesus years later, that we ultimately have to listen to him. And as we do that, we're following his plan,
Yeah.
But you're right. I mean, the whole reason we don't is because we tend to trust our own selves more than we trust God. We might say we trust God, but
Right.
then we don't obey him. And so there's this whole great reminder, in this whole deal that if we're going to say we trust God, our lives have to be lived out in obedience,
Right.
even when it doesn't quite make sense. And going back to some of these hard, one of these days moments, they're not making sense. So you used Rory's example, our young ones, like these days that hit us are very similar to a young one saying, I don't know why my parents tell me to do this, nor do I care. Like we're going, God, why are you putting us through this? I've been through those moments, even with this storm, going, God, why does the church have to go through this? Why do we have to do this more and more? Right. And at the end of the day, what I know he said to my heart, what I know he said to us as a church, and what I know he will say to you on the days that you go through something hard, a storm that's going your way, just trust me. And just continue to be obedient to what I've called you to. That's what in my journaling as of late, I've been asking a lot of these questions. That's what God keeps coming back with is be obedient to your calling. Don't worry about the reasons why all the time. God will give us some whys. He'll give us some reasons. But ultimately, if you know I've said go and do, go and do. And don't spend all your time going, why, God? Because
Right.
that can be a dead-end path, and you can spend a lot of energy on that.
Absolutely.
So anything else from Sunday, Audrey? Anything else, final thoughts before we go to our end the stream and go into our in-house? We're going to do a discussion here in-house, but anything left for us from this last Sunday?
I think the main thing is what I'm taking away from it is that Jesus is always there on the water with us. I think about these retellings of the stories of how he made his way, he was walking towards them, and like Pastor Michael pointed out, he may have almost walked past them. But anyways, he was there with them. He's there in the boat. And so for me, I just always have to, what I'm taking away from this and I always have to remind myself is that, hey, he's with you. The Lord is with you. So just don't forget it. If you're struggling launching out, remember he's with you. If you're struggling crying out, remember he's with you. If you're struggling with being trusting him and being obedient, he's with you no matter what. And so just remembering he's choosing to be with me. Therefore, all these other things, they're going to take some time. I'm not going to be perfect at it, but I should strive to go after it with him because he's never going to leave me.
That's great. Mine's completely not related to the topic from Sunday, but I did have one
Awesome.
final thought from what we've been seeing here. And I just want to encourage you guys here in the audience, you at home. these last few weeks, it kind of can seem repetitive, right? You get the same passage, same typical type of story. And the reflection I had, as we end was just, man, how much can God give you if you'll just spend time with His Word? Mm-hmm. Just spend time in this. Yes, you all probably have heard this story or know about it, but just rereading it and asking God to speak to your heart on a passage, and therefore God reveals something new. And even so much so that, like, you go to different books where they're kind of telling the same story, but the reason we have these differences that are not conflicts, but there are subtle differences, is because those differences from those human authors God inspired will allow you to see something totally different. Michael harped in on one of these days because of the way it was written in this specific telling of it in Luke. And so, just to encourage you, the power and the depth of God's Word, don't ever get tired of reading through the Word of God, of hearing the same stories from God, and of letting God speak to your life. And yes, it will be interesting in the weeks to come to see how many more of these boat stories we can get here at Calvary. But I'm sure our pastor's up for the challenge, so I look forward to that. Thank you for joining us online tonight. Let me just say again and encourage you, if you're able, we're here Wednesday nights. We've got a room full of teenagers and kids upstairs, and we would love to have you either in this room with us as we discuss after the stream, or there's also a ladies' Bible study going on that we would love you to be a part of. And let me just tell you, Sunday's coming. 9 o'clock, we have Bible studies all across campus, here on campus, 10:30's worship. Let me encourage you, if you're able, be here. Be encouraged by seeing people and being a part of the family of faith, and let your experience with Calvary become something truly in person. And I promise you, God's going to encourage your heart. And if you're able, we look forward to seeing you here in person this Sunday.